Okay, please be seated. You know, the other day we had a 4-part sermon or something like this. Today we're having a 2-part sermon. First part is down here on the floor, the second part is up there. So anyway, you may remember several weeks ago I did a diatribe about the word king and how I didn't like Jesus being called king because kings were mean and nasty people. And we looked at that word, and we looked at the word in the Aramaic and all of that stuff. But, you know, here we are. My gosh, I was at the Christmas carol sing. What was it called? Lessons and Carols up there. Beautiful. Great to be there. It was nice. And here we are singing king of this and king of that and, you know, all this other stuff. And the word king comes up in the Christmas carols hundreds of times. So how do I justify singing king in these Christmas carols? Well, this is the way I justify it. You can deal with it however you want to. But in the British Isles, what we call the British Isles, long before Christianity came to the British Isles, the Celts or the Druids or the early natives of that territory, whatever you want to call them, had kings, but the kings were a little bit different than we think of kings today. The kings were not passed on from father to son, etc. The kings were somehow chosen by the people, and they ruled for a set amount of time, 5 or 7 years, and then the king was sacrificed. Sacrificed. So their understanding of the king was a little bit different than the rest of the world's understanding of the king, because they selected somebody who knew he was going to die in 5 or 7 years, and maybe not a pleasant way of dying. I don't know how they sacrificed them. But, and so the real purpose of the king was to serve the people. And they had this idea of this king that if the king was good, the land and the people would thrive. If the king was bad or wounded, a wounded king, the land would be wounded also and suffer, and so would the people. So their idea of kingship was very different than the rest of Europe. And so when Christianity came to them, this idea of Jesus being sacrificed kind of fit into this model of kingship for them. So that worked for them, and that's one reason why they were easily kind of converted in a sense. So anyway, that's how I deal with the word king during this season. So anyway, that's how I deal with it. Part 2 is up here. I'm going to sit down for part 2. Because part 2 is a story, and I want to tell a story. When I was growing up in Ohio, my parents and I were members of what was called the Evangelical United Brethren Church. And they weren't very common out here. But basically it was a church that had German roots. The people that started that denomination were what we would call German Methodists. They were Methodists in Germany. But they came to the United States and they founded first the Brethren Church and the Evangelical Church, and then they combined the Evangelical United Brethren Church. And then in the 60s, because they were Methodists anyway, German Methodists, so to speak, they joined with the other Methodist church and they became the United Methodists. So that's why you have the word United Methodist. And so our denomination disappeared when I was in college. It was during college that I was introduced to the Episcopal Church, but that's a whole other story. So anyway, growing up, our family sat, I don't know why exactly, but our family sat in the second or third row on the pulpit side of the church every Sunday. And so I heard a lot of sermons, and the sermons there tended to be 25 minutes to half an hour. A little bit longer than most sermons except mine. And so I would listen to these, you know, and I had to sit up there, and, you know, after I got older and the youth group kind of had a balcony area that we sat in, so the youth group would sit up in the balcony and have a little more, less not quite right in front of the pastor. But anyway, so every once in a while my pastor would go on a mission trip or something like that, and he would come back, and it would delight me because he would have what I call a travel log sermon. So he would talk about his travels and his experiences and all those kinds of things, and much different than his normal sermons. And so today I'm going to give you a travel log sermon. So I was priest in New York State at the time, and I saw an ad in one of the church newsletters, probably the Living Church or one of those, and it says, pastors, come to the Holy Land for a familiarization tour for only $500. And even in the 80s, $500 wasn't very much. And that was airfare, room and board, meals, tourists, travel, and tour guides for, I think, 6 days in the Holy Lands for $500. Well, of course, their ulterior motive was, you'll like it so much, you'll bring some of your congregation next time, and they'll make money. But that never happened in my case. So I talked to a couple other pastors, and a couple of other priests, Episcopal priests in New York went with me, and so we had a little cubby Episcopal priest in this group. And so I had never been out of the North America, Central, I guess I was in Canada and Mexico, and I guess I had a little bit of time in the Caribbean, but really hadn't been overseas. And so I decided, well, this is an opportunity I'm going to take advantage of the best I can. So I'm going to go with this tour group for the 6 days, but then I'm going to stay another week afterwards. I'll have a chance to learn how to be an international tourist. I'll get an idea of how things are over there, and I'll be able to stay and do things that I couldn't do in the group. So I made the arrangements to fly back later, and I made the arrangements for most of the time I was there. I stayed at St. George's Cathedral in Jerusalem, which is the Anglican cathedral, and they have housing and meals and afternoon teas and all that kind of stuff, and pretty cheap. So this was a good deal, because not only was I able to stay there, but I mean, eating meals with all these Anglicans from around the world and talking was just really kind of neat. So one of the things I was going to do was this, because during the tour, we were a tourist group, of pastors and pastor spouses. We were like any other tourist group. You'd go someplace, you would spend 10, 15 minutes there. The tour guide would try to connect it to some kind of Bible story, and then you were off to someplace else. So that was fine, but that's not what I wanted. And so my biggest goal during that time was to spend more time at the church in the Nativity. Now, during the tour with the tour group, I learned several things. I learned there's different kinds of holy sites. There's historical holy sites. That's something that you can actually pin and say, yeah, this is the temple. This is a temple site. This is a historical site. And then there were sites that were traditional sites, which meant that it was a place that people traditionally have said such and such happened there, like the upper room. That's really a fakey one. But anyway, spiritual sites. So there is a spiritual site which is called the place where Jesus was born. And we don't know where Jesus was born, let's face it. And but this site, this is a cave, kind of a site, not a barn stable, but a cave. And this is, they say, where Jesus was born. And they said that for 100 years after the birth of Jesus, or 200 years after the birth of Jesus. So this place has been sanctified by hundreds of years of thousands and millions of people praying there. And so whether or not Jesus was born there or not, it carries that energy, that vibration there. And so the church is built over it, and it's called the Church of the Holy Nativity, and it's pretty old too. I don't remember how many years, but it's during the Crusades, the people would ride their horses into the church and cause havoc inside the church. And so the church people said, hey, this isn't good anymore. So they said one way to stop this is they made the door about this high. So you had to bow to get in, but horses couldn't make it. So they kept the horses out. So you get into the church, and there's the altar area, and down and to the side, how many people have been there? Maybe some of you have been there. Down to the side, there's steps that go down to this cave. And the cave isn't very big, you know, it's not as big as this room, for sure. And inside that cave, there are little niches or holes, cubby holes, or whatever you want to call them, where different churches, different faiths have their little shrines. And the Orthodox is really big over there. So there's a big Orthodox shrine, and then there's the Roman Catholic shrine, and there's other shrines. The main shrine down there has what's called the Star of Bethlehem in it. And this church, of course, is in Bethlehem. And the Star of Bethlehem is this silver star that's embedded into the floor. And this is supposed to be, and it's honored as the place where Jesus was born. And there's candles there and, you know, all kinds of stuff. So my goal was to go there, now that I knew where it was, and spend some time there alone. My own prayers. So, if you've been there, you know that's pretty hard to do. Because you have one tour group coming after another. But, you know, God was with me. So I went there and with the intention I'm going to stay here until I get some alone time. So I got down there, and the tradition is these tour groups come in, they spend very little time there, maybe 10 minutes. And as they're getting ready to leave, the tour guide says, okay, now we're going to sing Silent Night as we walk out, kind of thing. And so I was down there for several tour groups. I heard Silent Night, Steal a Knock, and I don't know what all the other languages I heard. But anyway, there were several tour groups that come and went. And I just kind of hung out there, and eventually one tour group left, and another one did not come down. I had maybe 10 minutes down there alone, which is really amazing when you think of it. And so I had my alone time. I could kneel in front of the Bethlehem Star, put my hands on it, I could pray, things you couldn't do when you were in this tour group. So it was a very spiritual and very touching time for me. So I had my alone time, and another group came down, and I said, okay, now I've done my thing, I'm going to go. Well, I had another goal in mind for that day, because I went, Jerusalem and Bethlehem is about 3 miles apart. So I had traveled to Bethlehem from Jerusalem on a Israeli bus, and got there and so forth, and went to the Church of Nativity. After that, I went to the main tourist center there in Bethlehem, because Bethlehem's a big tourist center. They sell lots of olive wood carvings and all kinds of nice little things. And I said, I want to go to the Shepherd's Field. Well, now as far as holy sites go, the Shepherd's Field is third class. There's no idea where the Shepherd's Field is, but it's a place that people have said, this is kind of from Bethlehem. This is maybe where the shepherds work. So we'll call this a Shepherd's Field, and we'll build shrines and altars here and all of that kind of stuff. And it's about 3 miles or so, or 2 miles downhill from Bethlehem. So downhill. So I talked to the people in the tourist shop, and they said, well, you can take a taxi down. I said, okay, I'll take a taxi down. So I took a taxi down to the Shepherd's Field, and I was in the taxi, and I was talking to the taxi driver. I said, how am I going to get back? He said, oh, don't worry about it. There's tour buses down here all day long, and you just go up to the tour bus driver and say you'd like a ride up the hill, and they'll give you one, you know, no big deal. I said, great. So I got there, and first of all, there were no tour buses there when I got there. As I arrived, 2 people walked out. Those were the only 2 people I saw the rest of the afternoon. So I was able to walk into the Shepherd's Field without tourists. And as I walked in, I had kind of one of those mystical, spiritual moments. I looked up, and in the sky was this huge flock of storks. And the storks were just circling around the shepherd's field. And and of course, in your own memory, in your mind, in your imagination, those storks became angels, announcing the birth of Christ to the shepherds. So a wonderful way to walk in. So I walked in, and it's kind of an open, it's fields and woods and trees, and there's a shrine here, and there's a grotto there, and there's an altar there, and it's just kind of outdoorsy, which was great for me. And so I had some more outdoor time in this holy place, and prayer time, and so forth. And so I want to say one more thing about the storks before I leave the shepherd's field. Several years after I had that experience, I was listening to NPR on the radio, and they were doing a little thing about Christmas, and they said, and I can't remember the name, and I can never find it again, King so-and-so from England had a prayer book. And in his prayer book, at the beginning, he would make notes about some of the sermons. And one of the notes he had about the sermon that one of the priests gave, was about a stork. And in this sermon, the stork was concerned about baby Jesus laying in scratchy straw. And so the stork had plucked feathers out to line the manger. And so that made that whole, even though it was several years later, it just brought that all back to me. So it was a very special moment. So anyway, I get out of the shepherd's field, get out to the parking lot. Of course, I didn't see any tourists in there. There are no buses there. There's no tourists. There's nothing. It's 3 o'clock in the afternoon or 2:30 or something like that. It's hot in Israel. And, it was in the 80s. I didn't carry water with me or anything like that. And so I looked at my situation, and I had no choice but to walk up to Bethlehem, up the hill in the heat. And I'm not a heat person. That did not make me a happy camper at all. And so I started up the hill, and I mean, it was a paved road, and I think it even had a sidewalk beside it, but there were no places to stop and get water or anything like that. So I started up the hill and grumbling to myself, I'm not happy, it's hot out here, and whatever. And then about maybe a fourth of the way up the hill, I had this other kind of, I don't know if you want to call it a mystical experience or a spiritual experience or whatever you want to call it, but all of a sudden I realized something, and it was like this: hey, Roger, you're walking the same path that the traditional shepherds walked to Bethlehem. And so then it no longer became a toilsome journey, it became a spiritual pilgrimage.
Wow.
And so, yikes, I could walk faster and I could enjoy my walk, and I wasn't so hot. And I get up to Bethlehem, I make it, and I go into the tourist central office again. It's about 3:50 or something like that in the afternoon. And I say, how do I get back to Jerusalem? And they said, all the Israeli buses have left already. So Israel at that time was an apartheid state. It was kind of divided. There were Israeli license plates and there were Palestinian license plates. There were Israeli buses, which were nice big coaches that were air conditioned, and there were Israeli and Palestinian buses, which were kind of makeover school buses that kind of were making it around town. And so they said the last bus leaves at 4. So I went down to the bus stop, and it was a Palestinian bus. It was one of those school buses. So, I didn't care. It's not that far, 3 miles or so on the bus. And so I get in the bus, and I was the only white person in the bus. All the rest were Palestinians. No other tourists in the bus. And so I get a seat about 3/4 of the way back, and I'm sitting there, and the bus takes off, and just didn't go very far, and all of a sudden we stop, and we're at a roadblock. And the roadblock has one of those spiky things that they lay in the road so you can't drive over it. So we had to stop, and the bus driver opens the door, and 3 Israeli soldiers come in with their Uzis,
Oh my gosh.
which they always carried in Israel. And I thought, oh my gosh, what's going to happen now? I said, I don't have my passport with me, because you don't travel with your passport most of the time. You leave it in the safe at St. George's so you don't lose it.
Yeah.
I said, this is going to be interesting. So I was sitting there, and I watched the soldiers come in, and they stop at every seat, and people would bring out papers or passports. I don't know what they were bringing out exactly. Israelis would look at them and give it back and go to the next place. They worked their way back, and I became more and more nervous because I didn't know what was. They looked at me, they saw this white man, and he just walked by. So that was that. Eventually, they satisfied their whatever they were looking for, and the spiky things got moved off the road, and we drove to Jerusalem. So that was kind of an exciting day for me in Jerusalem, but a very spiritual day too. And what you think about is, you know, especially at Christmas time, you think of Jesus, the Prince of Peace, the King of Peace, and Bethlehem being this birthplace of peace. And even at Bethlehem at that time in the 80s, it was not a peaceful place, you know, as demonstrated by this roadblock. And I think during Christmas time, we talk about peace and all these things on Christmas carols and Christmas cards and Christmas songs and all that. We need to realize that peace is very precious. And there's not much peace in the world. There is just not much peace in the world. There's countries that are at war, no peace there. There are many countries where there's turmoil, civil war, clan fighting, and there's no peace there. There are many families that don't even have peace within the families. There are many countries, even though they may not be at war, they're not peaceful places because the government isn't promoting peace and isn't promoting peaceful relationships between people. So during this Christmas time, we need to think about peace, our own peace, and how we can not only be peaceful people and peacemakers with others and family members, but how in our prayers we can send that peace out into the world in concentric circles, further and further and further with our prayers until we as an individual can kind of encompass the world in what our peace is. Our peace as we understand it, the peace of Christ. And so as we come closer to Christmas, think about that. Also remember kind of the theme we've been talking about during Advent. And that theme is how we are called to make our hearts cradles for the Christ child. And so we have a few more days until Christmas Eve, so focus on that a little bit. Also remember this great spiritual support we have in the whole spiritual world at this time, and kind of tap into that if you can. But work to make that heart ready to be a cradle for Christmas Eve as we come to church. You may hear some more travelogue stories later, but that's the only one that's dealing with Christmas time. So thank you.
Awesome. Thank you.